I always thought the people who loved you would be the ones to save you. I was wrong. The pain hit like a fist, crushing my chest from the inside. I couldn't breathe. My vision blurred. I reached toward my sister and whispered, "Please, call 911." She looked at me with disgust and snapped, "Stop overreacting. You're doing this for attention." Then she grabbed my phone and slammed it face down on the table. I remember the cold, hardwood floor against my cheek. I remember the silence, 12 people in that room, and not a single one reached for a phone. I remember my mother's eyes frozen, waiting for permission from my sister to help me. They all thought I was faking it. They assumed I was desperate to disrupt the will reading because I knew I'd been cut out. They had no idea what was actually in that envelope. And they had no idea that an ER doctor would soon place his hand on my sister's shoulder, look her dead in the eyes, and say 6 words that would shatter everything she believed. Have you ever been abandoned by the people who were supposed to protect you? My name is Nicole Barnes. I'm 36 years old, an accountant by profession, and for most of my life I believed that if you loved people hard enough, they would eventually love you back. I was wrong about that too. 2 weeks before the worst day of my life, I was sitting beside my father's hospital bed at home, reading him his favorite Hemingway novel, while the evening light faded through the curtains. He couldn't speak much anymore. The cancer had stolen most of his voice, but his eyes were sharp, aware, taking in everything around him. I visited 3 times a week, sometimes more when his condition worsened. I changed his sheets. I managed his medications. I took unpaid leave from work when he needed round-the-clock care. I did all of this because I loved him and because no one else would. My younger sister Laura visited too, of course, but her visits looked different. She came when our mother was watching phone already in hand, ready to capture the perfect photo of herself holding Dad's hand. She stayed 20 minutes, maybe 30, then rushed off to some appointment she couldn't miss. Our mother praised her endlessly for these performances. "Laura is so devoted," she would say. "She's sacrificing so much." Meanwhile, I was invisible, the daughter who did everything and received credit for nothing. I used to wonder why our mother favored Laura so completely. Then I learned the truth. Laura was born premature 2 months early and nearly died when she was just 2 days old. Our mother spent those first terrifying weeks believing she would lose her baby. She never recovered from that fear. For the next 3 decades, she compensated by giving Laura everything: attention, money, excuses, protection from every consequence. Laura grew up believing the world owed her simply for existing. And I grew up believing I wasn't worth worrying about. But my father saw things differently. He noticed who actually showed up. He noticed who read to him for hours and who just posed for photos. One evening when we were alone, he gripped my hand with surprising strength. His voice was barely a whisper, but I heard every word clearly. "I see everything, sweetheart. Everything." I didn't understand what he meant then. I thought he was just being kind. I had no idea he had discovered something about Laura 6 months earlier, something that changed everything. I had no idea he had been quietly building a case ever since, preparing for a battle I didn't even know was coming. In those final weeks, Laura started acting strangely. She kept asking whether I planned to attend the will reading. "You're always so busy with work, Nick. Are you sure you can make it? No one would blame you if you couldn't." The questions felt loaded, almost hopeful, like she wanted me to say no. She also started visiting our father more frequently, but only when I wasn't there, and only when our mother could witness her devotion. Meanwhile, my body was beginning to fail me. I ignored it the way I always ignored my own needs. Chest tightness that came and went, shortness of breath climbing stairs, cold sweats that woke me at 3 in the morning. I mentioned it to my mother once. She barely looked up from her phone. "You're just stressed, honey. You always overthink things." So I stopped mentioning it. I pushed through the pain and kept showing up for everyone else, never realizing that my heart was sending me warnings I couldn't afford to ignore. And then on the morning of the will reading, I woke with a weight on my chest that wouldn't lift. My hands were trembling before I even got out of bed. Something felt wrong, deeply, terribly wrong. I couldn't explain. It couldn't name it. But the feeling followed me as I got dressed, as I drove to my parents' house, as I walked through the front door into a room full of relatives who barely acknowledged my presence. I had no idea that in less than an hour I would be lying on the floor dying while my family watched and did nothing. The living room was already full when I arrived. Aunts, uncles, cousins I hadn't seen in years, all gathered in chairs arranged in neat rows like a funeral service. And there was Laura standing at the front of the room beside the lawyer's empty chair, greeting people as though she owned the place. She had arrived early to position herself as the host. She directed people to their seats. She accepted condolences with practiced grace. She was performing, and everyone was buying it. I found a chair in this corner, away from the center, and no one seemed to notice or care. My mother was across the room, surrounded by relatives who patted her hand and told her how lucky she was to have such a devoted daughter in Laura. I watched her nod and smile, accepting praise for a sacrifice that never happened. The lie was so complete, so effortless, that I wondered if she had started believing it herself. Throughout the morning, I heard the whispers. They weren't even trying to be quiet. Aunt Patricia leaned toward her daughter and murmured, "Nicole was never really close to Thomas. She barely visited at the end." My cousin Mark shook his head and said, "It's sad, really. Laura was the one who stepped up when it mattered." I sat there gripping the armrest of my chair, feeling each word like a knife sliding between my ribs. I had taken unpaid leave to care for my father. I had held his hand through the worst nights. I had read to him until my voice gave out. But to this room full of people, I was the absent daughter, the one who didn't care enough. When my mother stood up and announced to everyone that Laura had sacrificed so much to care for my father. In his final months, something inside me cracked. I wanted to stand up and scream the truth. I wanted to pull out my phone and show them the calendar entries, the pharmacy receipts, the notes from his doctors with my name on every emergency contact line. But I didn't. I stayed silent the way I always did. I swallowed my pain to keep the peace because that was what I had been trained to do since childhood. The lawyer finally arrived and took his seat at the front of the room. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder of documents. The room fell quiet. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. Laura stood beside him like a queen awaiting her coronation, her chin lifted, her eyes bright with anticipation. She had no doubt about what was coming, none at all. And that was when the pain hit. It started as pressure, like someone had placed a heavy stone on my chest. Then it tightened, squeezed, became a fist closing around my heart from the inside. I gasped and gripped the armrest so hard my knuckles turned white. Cold sweat broke out across my forehead, soaking through my blouse. My vision blurred at the edges, the room tilting and swimming. I tried to stand, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. They felt like they belonged to someone else. I reached toward my mother, my hand trembling in the air. My voice came out as barely a whisper. "Something's wrong. Please. I need help. Call 911. Every person in that room saw me. Every person heard my desperate plea. My mother's eyes met mine, and for one moment I thought she would come to me. I thought the woman who gave birth to me would push past everyone and take my hand and call for help. But then Laura's voice cut through the room like a blade. "Oh, stop it, Nicole. Stop overreacting." And her face twisted with contempt as she marched toward me. "You're doing this for attention because you know Dad left everything to me. You can't stand that he finally saw through you." I tried to reach for my phone on the side table, but Laura was faster. She grabbed it before I could silence it with a single swipe and slammed it face down on the coffee table, pushing it out of my reach. Then she turned to our mother, her voice firm and commanding. "Don't call anyone, Mom. She's faking it. If she makes a scene, we'll have to delay this whole thing. Just ignore her." My mother looked at me, then at Laura, then back at me. I could see the hesitation in her eyes, the decades of deference to her younger daughter fighting against some buried maternal instinct. But Laura's gaze was steady and certain, and my mother's was not. She didn't move. She didn't reach for her phone. She just stood there, frozen, waiting for permission that Laura would never give. The relatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Uncle Robert cleared his throat. Aunt Patricia looked at the floor. No one moved. No one spoke. No one helped. They were all witnesses to my suffering, and not a single one of them lifted a finger. The pain intensified, becoming something I cannot describe with words. My heart was failing. I could feel it stuttering, struggling, losing the rhythm that had kept me alive for 36 years. My legs buckled completely, and I crumpled to the hardwood floor. My cheek hitting the cold wood, my body folding in on itself. My breathing became shallow, ragged, desperate. I could feel my lips tingling, going numb. Somewhere in the distance, I heard someone gasp. I managed one last whisper before the darkness began closing in. "Dad." He knew. He saw. I don't know if anyone heard me. I don't know if it mattered anymore. The room fell completely silent. I could see feet shoes, the bottom of chairs. No one moved toward me. I watched my mother look at Laura, her face a mask of uncertainty. Laura crossed her arms and announced to the room in a voice cold enough to freeze water, "She'll be fine. She just wants to ruin this for me. She's always been jealous." The seconds stretched into an eternity. 30 seconds passed, a full minute. I lay motionless on the floor, struggling to breathe, my vision fading in and out. I could see the ceiling, the chandelier my father had installed 20 years ago, the crown molding he had painted himself. I thought about how strange it was that I might die in this room surrounded by family, and no one would even try to save me. What none of them knew was that someone else had been watching. Mrs. Eleanor, my father's neighbor and closest friend, had heard the shouting from her house next door. She had walked across the yard to see what was happening. She had been standing in the open doorway for several minutes, witnessing everything. She saw Laura grab my phone. She heard Laura tell our mother not to call for help. She watched my body hit the floor while a room full of relatives did nothing. And while my family stood paralyzed by their own cruelty and cowardice, Mrs. Eleanor had pulled out her phone with trembling hands and dialed 911. She gave them the address. She described my symptoms. She told them to hurry. The last thing I remember before losing consciousness was the distant sound of sirens growing louder, coming closer. And somewhere at the edge of my fading awareness, I heard Mrs. Eleanor's voice, sharp and fierce, cutting through the silence of that room like a blade of pure justice. She was already guiding the paramedics up the driveway, her eyes burning with a fury I had never seen in her before. She was ready to tell them exactly what she had witnessed, and she was ready to make sure that everyone in that house would answer for what they had done. The sirens were the last thing I heard before everything went black. Then there was nothing but darkness, a void where time didn't exist, where pain couldn't reach me anymore. I floated there for what felt like hours, or maybe just seconds. I couldn't tell the difference. When I started coming back, it was in fragments. Voices first, urgent professional voices calling out numbers, and medical terms I couldn't understand. The sensation of movement, of being lifted, of something pressing against my face, helping me breathe. Then bright lights overhead, fluorescent and harsh, streaming past, like I was being carried through a tunnel. I tried to open my eyes fully, but they wouldn't cooperate. I tried to speak, but there was something over my mouth, forcing air into my lungs. I learned later what happened in those critical minutes after I collapsed. Mrs. Eleanor told me everything when I was strong enough to hear it. She had guided the paramedics straight into my parents' living room, past the stunned relatives who were still standing exactly where they had been frozen in their own cowardice. The EMTs rushed to my side and began checking my vitals. Their faces turned grave almost immediately. One of them looked up at the room full of people and asked the question that would haunt my family for years to come. "She's in cardiac distress. How long has she been down?" Why wasn't 911 called immediately? Laura stepped forward with that practiced expression of concern she had perfected over a lifetime. She was already composing her excuse, already spinning the story. "I was just about to call when—" But Mrs. Eleanor cut her off before she could finish. Her voice was steady and cold, carrying the authority of a woman who had seen enough lies to last a lifetime. "That's not true. I was standing right there in the doorway. I saw you take her phone out of her hand. I heard you tell your mother not to call for help. I heard every single word you said." The paramedics exchanged glances. One of them made a note on his clipboard. According to Mrs. Eleanor, Laura's face drained of all color in that moment. For the first time in her life, she had been caught in a lie she couldn't charm her way out of. There was a witness. There was documentation. And there was nothing she could say to make it disappear. I don't remember the ambulance ride. I don't remember arriving at the emergency room. My next clear memory is waking up in a hospital bed with tubes in my arm and a steady beeping sound marking each beat of my heart. The room was quiet. The lights were dimmed. And sitting in a chair beside my bed was a doctor in blue scrubs reviewing a chart with an expression I couldn't read. He noticed I was awake and set the chart aside. His name was Dr. Reeves, and he had kind eyes that had clearly seen too much suffering. He explained my condition in simple terms. My heart had been under stress for months, sending warning signs I had ignored while I was busy taking care of everyone else. The episode at my parents' house had pushed it to the breaking point. If the paramedics had arrived even a few minutes later, I might not have survived. Then his expression changed. He leaned forward slightly and spoke to me in a voice meant only for my ears. I've documented everything about today, Ms. Barnes. The circumstances of your arrival, the delay in calling for help, the witness account from the woman who called 911. He paused, letting the words settle. What happened to you today, the way your family responded, it's all in your medical file now. If you ever need evidence for any reason, legal or otherwise, it exists. I want you to know that. I didn't fully understand what he meant at the time. I was still foggy from the medications, still trying to process the fact that I had almost died on my parents' living room floor while my family watched and did nothing. But I thanked him, and I saw something in his eyes that looked like quiet anger held carefully in check. What I didn't witness but learned about later was what happened in the waiting room. Dr. Reeves found Laura sitting among the relatives, her arms crossed, her foot tapping with impatience. He asked her to step into the hallway with him. She followed, probably expecting an update on my condition, probably already preparing her performance of sisterly concern. In that hallway, away from our mother, away from the aunts and uncles and cousins, Dr. Reeves looked Laura directly in the eyes. His voice was quiet and professional, but it carried the weight of a man who had watched too many patients die from preventable causes. He said 6 words that would shatter everything Laura believed about herself and her place in this family. She nearly died because of you. Laura's mouth opened to argue, to deflect, to explain away her actions the way she always did. But Dr. Reeves raised his hand and stopped her. I'm not interested in excuses. I'm telling you this because you need to understand exactly what almost happened today. The delay in calling for help, the removal of her phone, those minutes mattered. In cardiac events, every second counts. Your sister's heart was failing while you stood there and did nothing. That's not drama. That's medicine. When they returned to the waiting area, Dr. Reeves addressed the entire family. His tone was calm but pointed, and no one dared interrupt. When someone says they need medical help, you listen. You call 911 immediately. What happened in that house today should never happen to anyone. I hope each of you thinks carefully about the choices you made. Late that evening, when the hospital had grown quiet and the hallways were empty, Mrs. Eleanor came to sit beside my bed. She took my hand in hers, her grip gentle but firm. Her eyes were wet with tears. She was trying not to shed. Your father asked me to watch over you, she said softly. He knew this family, Nicole. He saw how they treated you, how they overlooked you, how Laura always came first. His exact words to me were, Nicole is the only one who truly loved me. When I'm gone, don't let them break her. She paused, squeezing my fingers, gathering herself before continuing. But there's something else he wanted you to know. He told me that when the will was read, you might be surprised. He said he had been watching and waiting for months, gathering evidence, making sure his final wishes couldn't be challenged. He said, I'm going to protect her the only way I still can. Tears streamed down my face. My father, even in his final months when he could barely speak, had been fighting for me. He had seen everything. He had understood everything. And he had made a plan to protect me even after he was gone. I fell asleep that night, holding Mrs. Eleanor's hand, feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. The next morning, I woke to find the family lawyer standing at the foot of my bed. He was carrying a sealed envelope and a thick folder pressed against his chest. His expression was serious, but not unkind. He looked at me and said quietly, Your father anticipated this day might come. He left very specific instructions and evidence he wanted only you to see. The lawyer opened the sealed envelope right there in my hospital room and handed me the contents. There was a handwritten letter from my father and a note explaining that the formal will reading would take place at his office once I was discharged. He wanted me to read my father's words privately first, before the rest of the family learned what was coming. I held that letter in my trembling hands and read it through, tears that wouldn't stop falling. My father's handwriting was shaky, but clear, the words of a man who knew he was running out of time. Don't let them break your heart again, sweetheart. You were the daughter I was proud of. You were the only one who loved me for who I was, not for what I could give you. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you while I was alive, but I can protect you now. I pressed that letter to my chest and sobbed until a nurse came to check on me. Several days later, after I was discharged from the hospital and had regained enough strength to face what was coming, the formal will reading took place at the lawyer's office downtown. The family gathered in a conference room with a long wooden table and leather chairs. Laura sat across from me, her posture confident, her expression composed. She still believed the will would favor her. She was the devoted daughter after all. She was the one who had sacrificed so much. At least that was the story she had been telling herself and everyone else for years. The lawyer cleared his throat and began. He announced that my father had rewritten his will 1 month before his death. The room went still. Laura's confident smile flickered, but held. Then the lawyer read the terms. The majority of my father's estate, the house, the investments, the savings account, everything of significant value went to me. Laura and my mother would receive only the legally required minimum, a token amount that couldn't be contested under state law. Laura leaped to her feet, her face contorted with rage. "This is insane! He wasn't in his right mind. His brain was gone by the end. Everyone knows that. He had dementia. He didn't know what he was signing." She looked around the room, expecting support, expecting the relatives to back her up the way they always had. The lawyer remained calm, completely unruffled by her outburst. "Actually, Ms. Barnes, your father anticipated you might make that claim. That's why there's more." He opened the thick folder he had been carrying and began to explain. 6 months before his death, my father received a phone call from his bank. Someone had attempted to withdraw $30,000 from his savings account using a forged signature. The bank's fraud department had flagged the transaction and rejected it. They provided my father with full documentation, including a professional handwriting analysis. The lawyer paused and looked directly at Laura. "The analysis identified you as the forger, Ms. Barnes." The room went completely silent. I watched Laura's confident expression crumble like a mask falling away to reveal something ugly underneath. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. For the first time in her life, she had nothing to say. The lawyer continued, his voice steady and professional. My father hadn't confronted Laura about the forgery. He was afraid of what she might do if she knew he was aware. Instead, he spent the next 5 months quietly watching her, gathering additional evidence and taking steps to ensure his final wishes couldn't be challenged. He consulted with 2 independent physicians who examined him and certified in writing that his mental faculties were completely intact. He had 3 witnesses present when he signed the new will, all of them respected members of the community with no connection to the family. He told the lawyer, "I want to make sure Laura can never claim I didn't know what I was doing." The lawyer looked at Laura with something close to pity. "He knew exactly what he was doing, Ms. Barnes. He just wanted to see if you would confess, if you would show any remorse for what you tried to do. You never did." But that wasn't all. The lawyer then presented Mrs. Eleanor's formal written statement, a detailed eyewitness account of what happened the day I collapsed. Every word Laura had said was documented. "Don't call anyone. She's faking it. If she makes a scene, we'll have to delay this." The statement described Laura grabbing my phone and silencing it. It described the minutes that passed while I lay unconscious on the floor and no one in my family called for help. The lawyer explained that my father had asked Mrs. Eleanor to be vigilant after he discovered the forgery. He suspected Laura might try to interfere with my inheritance somehow. He just never imagined she would go as far as she did. He addressed me directly then. "Your father built this case over 5 months, Nicole. Mental competency, certifications, witness signatures, the bank's fraud documentation, and now Mrs. Eleanor's testimony about what happened the day you nearly died. He wanted to make absolutely certain that when the time came, his wishes could not be challenged and his evidence could not be ignored." I sat there in stunned silence, tears streaming down my face. My father, weak and dying, barely able to speak, had spent his final months preparing for this battle. He had known what Laura was. He had known what my mother would allow. And he had never stopped fighting for me, even when I didn't know there was a fight. In the days that followed, my own lawyer sent formal letters to every member of my family. The terms were clear. If anyone contested the will or attempted to contact me without my explicit permission, all evidence would be submitted to police and released to local media. The forged signature documentation, the bank's fraud report, Mrs. Eleanor's testimony, the hospital's medical records showing how long I had been in cardiac distress before help arrived. My lawyer explained something else to me privately. Laura hadn't merely failed to call 911. She had actively interfered with my ability to get help by taking my phone and instructing our mother not to call. "In most states, there's no legal duty to help a stranger," he said, "but actively preventing someone from accessing emergency services is different. That's interference. Combined with the forgery, if you wanted to pursue criminal charges, you have a very strong case. I told him I would think about it. I wasn't ready to make that decision yet. Within days, word spread through our small Connecticut community. These things always do. Laura's employer, a regional insurance company where she had worked for 8 years, placed her on administrative leave pending an internal review. The relatives who had spent years praising her devotion and criticizing my absence suddenly stopped returning her phone calls. The reputation she had carefully constructed over a lifetime, the dutiful daughter, the family caretaker, the one who sacrificed everything, collapsed into dust. My mother called me once during that week. Her voice was barely recognizable, broken in a way I had never heard before. I heard what she said, Nicole. Laura told me not to help you, and I listened. My own daughter was dying on the floor, and I just stood there. I'll never forgive myself. I didn't know what to say to her, so I said nothing. I wasn't ready to forgive her either. I didn't know if I ever would be. 3 days later, there was a knock at my apartment door. I opened it to find Laura standing there, her mascara streaked down her cheeks, her voice cracking, her hands trembling at her sides. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. She looked like someone whose entire world had collapsed around her. She had come to beg for mercy. But I had already made my decision, and it wasn't the forgiveness she was praying for. Laura stood in my doorway, looking like a ghost of the woman she used to be. Her designer clothes were wrinkled, as if she had slept in them. Her eyes were swollen and red from days of crying. Her hands trembled at her sides. She had lost weight, and not in a healthy way. The confident sister who had commanded that living room, who had grabbed my phone and told our mother to let me die, was gone. In her place stood someone desperate and broken. "Please, Nicole," she said, her voice cracking on every word. "I'm going to lose everything. My job, my reputation, everything I've built. You're my sister. We're blood. You have to forgive me. You have to make this stop." I stepped aside and let her into my apartment. I gestured to the couch, and she sat down, perching on the edge like she might need to run at any moment. I took the chair across from her and looked at her for a long moment before speaking. My voice was calm and steady, unmoved by her tears. "I'm not going to press criminal charges for the forgery," I said, "and I'm not going to release Mrs. Eleanor's testimony to the media." Laura's face flooded with relief. Her shoulders sagged. She started to thank me, started to reach for my hand, but I wasn't finished. "Here are my conditions," I continued, and I watched her relief freeze into uncertainty. "You will complete a full therapy program. Not 4 sessions, not 8 sessions. A real program at least 6 months with a licensed therapist who specializes in family trauma. You will sign a written statement acknowledging exactly what you did. The forged signature. The lies you told about me to our relatives, and what you said and did while I was dying on that floor." I paused to let the words settle. "And you will never contact me again unless I reach out first. No calls, no texts, no showing up at my door. If you violate any of these conditions, everything goes to the police. The forgery documentation, the hospital records, Mrs. Eleanor's statement, all of it." Laura's face transformed from relief to outrage in the span of a heartbeat. "That's not fair. After everything. After all we've been through as sisters, you're just going to throw me away. You're going to hold this over my head forever." I felt something shift inside me. For 36 years, I had swallowed my anger to keep the peace. I had stayed silent while Laura took credit for my sacrifices. I had smiled through the pain of being invisible in my own family. But I wasn't that woman anymore. I had died on that living room floor, and someone stronger had woken up in the hospital. My voice sharpened. "Fair, you want to talk to me about fair. You looked at me on the floor, struggling to breathe, my lips turning blue, and you told Mom to let me die, so you could delay a will reading. You took my phone out of my hand so I couldn't save myself. You stood there with your arms crossed while I was dying and told everyone I was faking it." I leaned forward. "You don't get to talk to me about fair, Laura. These are my terms. Take them or leave them." She took them. She didn't have a choice. I learned later what happened in her therapy sessions. Not from Laura herself, but from the therapist's summary that was required as part of our agreement. In those sessions, Laura was finally forced to examine the root of her behavior. She couldn't charm her way out. She couldn't spin a story. She had to sit with the truth of who she was and what she had done. And eventually the truth spilled out. Not as an apology, not as a plea for understanding. Just raw, ugly honesty. that had been buried for decades. She told her therapist, "I always knew Nicole was the better person. Dad loved her more. I could see it in his eyes every time she walked into the room. He looked at her the way he never looked at me. I've hated her for it my entire life. I thought if I could just win, if I could take everything that was supposed to be hers, it would prove that I mattered, that I was worth something, that I deserved to be loved too." She broke down completely. But I wasn't trying to be better than her. I was just trying to destroy her, because if I couldn't have what she had, I didn't want her to have it either. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't healing. It was simply the poison being named, dragged into the light where it could no longer hide. And for Laura, it marked the beginning of a very long road that she may never reach the end of. A week after my confrontation with Laura, my phone rang. It was my mother. Her voice was barely recognizable, broken and exhausted, emptied of the confident authority she had wielded my entire life. "I know I don't deserve anything from you," she said. "I failed you your entire life. I chose Laura over and over, and I don't even understand why anymore. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry. I'm so deeply sorry. And if you never want to speak to me again, I'll understand. I'll accept it." I was silent for a long moment. Memories flooded through me. Every time I was overlooked, every accomplishment that went unnoticed, every sacrifice that was invisible, the years of being the daughter who didn't need attention while Laura consumed everything. Then I said quietly, "I'm not ready to forgive you, Mom. I don't know if I ever will be. But I'm not closing the door forever. Not yet. I need time. A lot of it. Maybe years. And I need you to respect that without pushing, without guilt-tripping, without making it about your pain." It wasn't reconciliation. It wasn't even the promise of one. But I gave my mother what I refused to give Laura, the distant, uncertain possibility of a different future. Because unlike Laura, our mother was weak, not malicious. And I knew the difference. In the weeks that followed, I sold my old apartment and moved to a small cottage 3 streets away from Mrs. Eleanor. The woman who saved my life became my true family. We had Sunday dinners together. We took morning walks in the park. She saw me, valued me, chose me. For the first time in 36 years, I learned what it felt like to be prioritized. Using a significant portion of my inheritance, I established a scholarship fund in my father's name through the American Heart Association. The fund provides financial assistance to heart patients who lack insurance, people who might be ignored when they need help the most. Mrs. Eleanor was the first to contribute. At the small dedication ceremony, I unveiled a memorial plaque with an inscription I wrote myself for Thomas Andrew Barnes, who saw everything and loved anyway. Standing before the small crowd, I read a few words I had prepared. My father couldn't speak much in his final months. But he didn't need words to show me who he was. He watched, he protected, he planned, and even after he was gone, he was still fighting for me. This fund is my way of continuing his fight, helping people who have no one in their corner the way he was always in mine. 6 months later, I received a letter from Laura. It was 4 pages long, filled with explanations, justifications, childhood memories, and pleas for reconciliation. I recognized her handwriting. I felt the weight of the envelope. I opened it, read the first paragraph, and stopped. Then I folded the letter carefully, placed it in a drawer beside my father's last note, and closed it. I didn't need Laura's explanations. I didn't need my mother's guilt. I didn't even need the inheritance, though it had given me a freedom I had never known before. What I needed, what I had spent 36 years searching for, I had finally found. A life where I wasn't invisible, a family that chose me, and the unshakable knowledge that my father, in the end, had seen me, truly seen me, and loved me exactly as I was. That was enough. That was everything. If Nicole's story touched something deep in your heart today, I want you to know that you are not alone. So many of us have lived some version of this pain. We have been the invisible ones in our own families, the ones who gave everything and received nothing in return. We have swallowed our hurt to keep the peace, smiled through the neglect, and wondered in our quietest moments if anyone would ever truly see us for who we are. But here is what Nicole's journey teaches us, and I hope you carry this with you long after this story ends. Your worth is not determined by the people who fail to recognize it, the family that overlooks you, The siblings who compete with you, the parents who favor someone else, their blindness does not diminish your value. It reveals their limitations, not yours. You are not invisible. You have simply been surrounded by people who refuse to open their eyes. Nicole did not win because she inherited her father's estate. She won because she finally stopped accepting less than she deserved. She learned that forgiveness does not mean giving someone permission to hurt you again. She discovered that setting boundaries is not cruelty, but wisdom. She understood that walking away from toxic relationships is not abandonment, but survival. And most importantly, she found the courage to build a new life with people who actually chose her, who saw her worth, without her having to prove it over and over again. If there is someone in your life who has made you feel small, who has dismissed your pain, who has taken your sacrifices for granted while celebrating someone else, I want you to hear these words clearly. You are allowed to walk away. You are allowed to protect your peace. You are allowed to stop giving your heart to people who treat it carelessly. You are allowed to choose yourself after decades of choosing everyone else. That is not selfishness. That is self-respect. And it is never too late to claim it. Nicole was 36 when her life changed. But this truth applies whether you are 36 or 56 or 76. Every single day you have the power to decide that you will no longer shrink yourself to fit into spaces where you were never valued. Every single day you can choose to be your own family, your own protector, your own champion. Thank you for staying with me through this entire story. If Nicole's journey resonated with something in your own life, I would love to hear about it in the comments below. Have you ever been the overlooked one in your family? Have you ever had to set painful but necessary boundaries with people you loved? Your experience might be the encouragement someone else desperately needs to hear today. Our community grows stronger when we share our truths with each other. And if this is your first time joining us, please consider subscribing to our channel and turning on notifications. We share stories like this every week, stories about resilience, justice, and the quiet strength it takes to reclaim your life. Until next time, remember this. You deserve to be seen, you deserve to be loved, and you are never too old to finally put yourself first.